My name is Seth Spencer. I'm the Teach Climate Network Coordinator for Climate Generation. I do use he, him pronouns, and I'm coming to you from the traditional and contemporary lands of the Dakota and Anishinaabe here in Apple Valley, Minnesota, which is a suburb of Minneapolis and St. Paul. Thanks, Andrea and Lucy, for introducing yourselves. And I want to go ahead and welcome our youth panelists, Sophia Karan-Moore, Yasmin Abdurrahman, and Yvonne Monger. And also, I should always check, I've had some tech issues recently. Can everybody see my shared screen? Perfect, okay. Again, we are coming to you today from the lands of the Dakota and Anishinaabe people. I do invite you to find what native lands you are on with a link that I'm going to drop into the chat right now. When you've had a chance to look at that, feel free to share. We do take time to acknowledge the native land we are on, because one of the effects of genocide and colonization is that it can be easy for us all to forget that we are still occupying land, and that Indigenous individuals and communities are still alive and leading changes in our world. We also recognize the tremendous resilience and innovative climate solutions that are created by these communities, and we seek to raise up their voices in climate change education. And Climate Generation is incredibly proud of the diversity of our country, and we know that our vision for an equitable future will be achieved when people of all communities work together, bridging experiences and expertise from across the globe. Thanks everyone for introducing yourselves. I also like to give a little bit of context. Why is Climate Generation, a Will Steger legacy, doing this work? We just redid our vision this past spring and really are focusing on three main areas, which are to ignite and sustain the ability of educators, youth, and communities to act on the systems that perpetuate the climate crisis. And we hope to accomplish this through three overarching strategies guided by our team, which are to overcome disinformation, center anti-racism and systemic equity, and personalize and localize climate change action. And so we are now, I think, in our fourth of 7 workshops throughout the fall and winter that are really focusing on looking at different ways that educators can either teach climate change education or support youth leaders to bring climate change action. So today we are going to be focusing on grounding in the theme of supporting youth leaders. We're going to depending on time, I think we're going to try a listening partnership, see how that goes. And then I'll be turning it over to our wonderful youth panel. And then at the end, always sharing a few more resources for our educators. So first kind of activity, all of our workshops are interactive. If you've not ever used slido.com, hopefully this won't be too complicated, but what you're going to do is in your browser, I'll put it in the chat, just go to slido.com and it's going to ask you for a number. That number, again, put it in the chat, but you should be able to see here is 646148. And I'm just asking you, do you consider yourself an activist or an advocate? It can be either or it can be both. And just curious what folks' responses are. So I'm going to give you a minute to do that. And then I think it will ask you another question right after that. We'll see. But I'll just give you a minute to respond to that. And our youth panelists, of course, can also respond to this if you'd like. Wonderful. Thanks for putting in those responses already. Wonderful. Ooh, that's a good question, Lucy. I always try to no, nothing. I have learned that even after a year and a half of this virtual world, especially if I'm on a new platform, I am basically useless. So I wonder if right now you are viewing us in full screen. So if in the upper right-hand corner, there might be an area that asks you, you can click on it and you can change it from full screen to either a minimized view. And that would then allow you to open another browser. That's usually my issue. Perfect. Okay, role possibly changes depending on the situation. Bend both, definitely. Yeah. I'm gonna give you another 30 seconds or so. Wonderful. And then I don't know, I have not personally tested this, but I wonder if it asks you possibly another question. I did set this up, so hopefully there would be one more question. And what are you an activist for? What do you advocate for? Let me know in the chat if you're not seeing that, but I'll give you oh, good. Thanks, Andrea. Wonderful. Thanks for those responses. Great. I'll give you about another 30 seconds and then I'll go ahead and move on. Perfect. Okay, so whether you think you're an activist or not, whether you are, whether you hope to be, or potentially think it's not for you, I guess that the fact that you're here, you're probably a little more comfortable than the average person in our society, because unfortunately those terms have both activist and potentially even advocate have been taken over a little bit and have been made into a little more dangerous in the education world. But in today's world, we need educators to be those advocates and potentially activists more than ever. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about ways of supporting youth leaders from kind of climate generation's perspective, from myself as an educator's perspective. But of course, we'll be hearing from our youth panelists that might say what I have to say isn't enough. And that's exactly why we partner with on these programs. So the need for teachers to be advocates and activists and not shy away is that we know educators are incredibly passionate, knowledgeable, and ethical, and yet sometimes we have to push the boundaries because we're stuck in systems where change comes slowly, if at all. And Melinda Anderson, who you see a quote from here, is an author who wrote that in Becoming a Teacher, she talks about educators as revolutionaries and breaking the rules to do its best for youth as an act of even subversion, which sometimes sounds like pretty strong language, but it's important for us to at least think about that a lot of our youth are receiving information about incredibly important issues, sometimes only in school. And so thinking about how to handle highly charged topics in class, such as climate change, racism, or even COVID-19, teachers can teach about these topics and be revolutionaries. Students are entering the classroom from the outside world, and so we need to help prepare students for the world outside of the school walls. And so some questions to ask yourselves, and you may hear me say these and say, no way in heck am I going to do that, because in maybe your school district, your school, your organization, it's not safe for you to do that. And we understand that there are a lot of challenges, but we do always want us to think about, as educators, are there ways we can support youth, such as supporting youth climate strikes, taking young people and their ideas seriously, integrating activism into credit-based assignments, and even thinking about what more we can do to help students understand and play a role in current events. And one thing I forgot to mention is we have a small enough group that if you have a question as we go, feel free to unmute yourself, but also I am able to see the chat, and that's always a great way to ask anything as I move forward. So to be successful in our work with youth, we must understand a particular condition of youth, that young people can and often are potentially mistreated and disrespected simply because they are young. And so understanding adultism is really important as educators. And I think we've all experienced it growing up. Potentially we've even been perpetrators. It's easy, I know, as an educator, it's sometimes easy to forget that youth are coming with incredibly unique experiences, and sometimes more real world experiences of a situation than we are. And so to at least be able to listen to that youth perspective is incredibly important. So the word adultism really refers to behaviors and attitudes based on the assumption that adults are better than young people and entitled to act upon youth without their agreement. And this mistreatment can be enforced by social institutions, laws, customs, and attitudes. And so this can get in the way of more effective youth-adult partnerships. And we need to reflect on your relationship with our students and youth and practice what is listed here. And just a general reminder, if you can, make sure you're on mute. I think one person maybe had just reconnected, so. So we know some educators are worried about pushback, particularly from parents, school boards, even superintendents, which can contribute to educators not teaching about climate change. But I do think it's important to remind ourselves that overwhelmingly families, communities want climate change to be taught in schools. And if you've not ever used this Yale program on climate change communication, this is a pretty great resource for really looking at opinions across the United States. And so 78% of adults do believe that schools should teach about the causes, consequences, and potential solutions to global warming. What I always think is really cool about this is that you can even zoom into your specific county. So right around the metro area, we have a little bit higher. We're almost in the 80%, but you can see kind of different pockets throughout the US. So what we teach students goes back to the community through their parents and their families. We know this. And so empowering youth voice in the classroom really empowers them to use their voice in their communities. And youth are important for changing parents' perceptions around climate change. And because climate change perceptions in children seem less susceptible sometimes to the influence of political context, it can even be possible for children to inspire adults toward greater levels of climate concern and, in turn, collective action. So I'm going to kind of, I have another activity, but I think I'm going to move past that and kind of see where we're at, because I do really want us to have a chance to hear from our amazing youth panelists. And so I'm going to do a quick reintroduction. And we'll turn it over to them in just a second. So as I mentioned, I want to introduce our wonderful 3 members of Climate Generations Youth Environmental Activists, or YA, and really have them share what they are doing and how educators can be great allies and supportive mentors. So thank you again to Sophia, Yasmin, and Yvonne for sharing your time, energy, and passion with us. And so I will have you do like a quick introduction, and then I'm going to ask some of the prepared questions. Our wonderful educators, if you have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat, and I'll probably just kind of ask them. But I'm going to mute myself. I'm going to pin our three folks to the top, and then if you want to just go around and introduce yourselves, and then I'll ask the first question. Give me one, and I'm going to stop my screen share at the moment. So Sophia, if you wouldn't mind going ahead and starting, just because I can see you first.
Hello, my name is Sophia, and I'm a senior at St. Louis Park High School, which is pretty close to Minneapolis. And I've been working with youth environmental activists for about 2 years now. The main things that we're working on right now is planning the Youth Climate Justice Summit, which is where it's an annual event where youth get together and speak with legislators at the Capitol in St. Paul. And we're also working on a climate justice education bill that would include model programs and resources for teachers so that teachers can basically it would just help teachers teach about climate justice better. And yeah.
Thanks, Sophia. I'm going to turn it over to Ismi.
Hi, my name is Sameen Abdurrahman. I'm a junior at Rosemont Senior High School and a student at University of Northwestern St. Paul. And I've been part of since the beginning of the school year, and I've also taken part of their summit last March or during the spring. And I'm also, I'd like to say, helping with the passing the bill as well, which is, I came late in the game, but it's a really amazing bill. So yeah.
Thank you. And Yvonne.
Hi, everybody. My name is Yvonne, and I go by she, her pronouns. I also go to Rosemont High School, and I'm a senior there. And I also take PSEO classes through Northwestern University in St. Paul online. And yeah, basically, we've been working on the summit and the bill. I think Sophia and Yasmin pretty much said it all. So.
Wonderful. Thanks again for joining us tonight. I'm going to go ahead and put the first question in the chat. And really, I'll just kind of let you all unmute yourselves. There's no specific order, but just share what your thoughts are. And then our wonderful educators, if you have follow-up questions, this is an informal enough group that we can respond directly back. And I might read the question because I always forget that folks that are watching this later will not always be able to see the chat. So what advice do you have for educators on how they can best support youth action?
I can start off again. So for me, it's two main things. The first thing is teaching us about issues that are relevant to our lives, such as racism and climate change, and especially like how those things intersect. Because like you said earlier, Seth, like school is supposed to prepare us for the world outside of school, but we're not really going to be prepared unless we understand issues that impact us. And a lot of students don't really have the time or resources to learn about those issues outside of school. And that being said, like when you're teaching that, making sure that you have high expectations for all of the students and that you're making sure that all of the students are learning what they need or what they need to learn, regardless of like the student's racial background and that sort of thing. And then I would say the second thing that comes to mind is actively searching for opportunities for youth, like searching for organizations in your area, similar to the program that I'm in, or searching for like protests that are going on, and then providing your students with like the resources to be able to access those organizations and programs, I think is really helpful, because being in a group of youth that are all working towards the same thing together is very empowering. And thank you for coming tonight.
I kind of agree with what Sophia said. I think keeping just all of the youth in your community informed is really helpful, and also keeping them kind of up to date, if that makes sense, with like current issues that are happening in your specific area. I think that's helpful, and it'll make the like more students more involved with what they're doing because it directly impacts them. And also kind of what Seth was saying earlier, avoiding adultism, because though we are young, we do understand, and it is important to understand the effects of climate change.
I'll go ahead and ask my next question then.
Read it aloud, Seth.
Thanks for that reminder, Lucy. See, I'm not great at that one. How does your climate justice and anti-racism work intersect? And I won't put anybody on the spot, but yeah, feel free to just unmute yourselves and chime on in.
I believe that climate change and racial injustice does share the same roots, if not similar, if not same roots, because climate change is a result of, in my opinion, colonialism. An example of this, a recent one would be maybe Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Maria. And while the lives lost were a result of extreme weather, it's also a result of racism and neglect. And the burden of climate change impacts, climate impacts has fallen on mainly Black, Indigenous, and other POC communities. And in order to address climate change, it requires us to examine racial disparities and use that understanding to create solutions so we can have fair and equal treatment for all people, regardless of their race.
I think that was very well put. And just to provide another example, like yesterday there was a lot of like severe weather where I live, and also a bit further south to Iowa there were a lot of tornadoes, and that's just very rare for this like time of year because it's December. And like we were having a thunderstorm in December, and it was just so weird. And it's like every time that happens, it just is kind of a reminder of the climate crisis. And like, because I have a lot of privilege, I was able to just like stay home and not worry about it too much. But like some of my friends who like don't have home insurance or like live in a little apartment, like it's not as easy for them to deal with the effects of the climate crisis. So it just shows that racism intersects with the climate crisis, because people of color and people of lower incomes and people with disabilities do bear the worst effects, just like Yasmin said. So yeah.
To add to what Sophia said, I think so yeah, here in Apple Valley at least, or the suburb areas, we've been having extreme weather. So the other week we had extreme snow. I think it was maybe like 12 to 18 inches of snow. And, you know, all of the snow was happening all at once because of global warming, because in October and November, it was not even that cold. And typically in Minnesota, it's already snowing by October. So, and then even I think yesterday or the night before, we were having the thunderstorms and all the fog in the morning, the extreme fog. It was all because of the extreme snow on the ground mixing with the warmth of the atmosphere, which is not normal for December in Minnesota, and tornadoes even. We're in the middle of the, North America. We shouldn't be having tornadoes ever, like period. So yeah, and I think it relates to, racism, because I feel like certain areas in Minnesota, more specifically like Minneapolis and St. Paul, that type of area, they get their climate change, or their climate is just simply worse compared to the suburbs. And typically that's where most people of color are living. So I think they just neglected their right to having a healthier climate simply because of how they look, which is really unfair.
Thank you all for, kind of sharing your thoughts on that incredibly important topic and work. This is one that I am always interested in because I'm always curious of how youth get interested in this work, get passionate about this work. And I will say that it inspires me all that you're here, because at 16, 17, 18, I did not have this passion or the thought process to do this work. And so it's wonderful to see you all doing this. So the question is, what does your climate change education experience look like in your school? How does your classroom-based climate change education support or potentially not support your work outside of the classroom? Because I think that's a topic that educators are always curious about is what I'm teaching helping? Is it possibly discouraging? All of these things.
In my opinion, I think there's actually a lack of climate change education being taught in classrooms. And I think also COVID-19 had a huge impact on this, because like when COVID happened, I was in 9th grade. So a lot of, for example, my science teachers were unable to teach us this in depth. So that's one big factor. But at the same time, I do think it wasn't being taught as much as it should have been. And the support of climate change education in my schools, I think it's a lot. There's a lot of support. For example, one of my 10th grade biology teachers, she has a lot of support for this. So it very much so varies in between classes and teachers. So
I probably agree with Yasmin. I feel like we're talking about the same teacher maybe, but yeah, I have a teacher who is pretty active in climate change, and she tries to enforce it a bit in her class. But unfortunately, it's only her class, and there's 2,000 other students, and she doesn't teach every student. So I don't know. I feel like the opinion of climate change in general throughout my school is maybe a bit indifferent because it's not even brought up enough. I didn't really learn about climate change through school. I learned it through a friend. So yeah, I just feel like I wasn't really educated on climate change at all during my school.
Yeah, I would say it's pretty similar for me. So in 9th grade, everyone like in my school takes environmental science. So like in taking that class, you do learn a little bit about climate change, but it's mostly just like, this is how climate change is caused. Here are like maybe some of the effects. But it didn't really go into depth on like how it intersects with racism. And that's important because we need to prioritize like the groups that are affected the most, which is mostly the BIPOC community. And yes, and it also didn't really teach about like very much about solutions and what we can like do. And it didn't really teach very much about how it's a systemic issue. And maybe that does kind of go back to the adultism, where it's like, I don't think my teacher really expected that we would be able to understand how it's a systemic issue. But I think we could have understood. So I mostly learned about it through youth environmental activists and not through school. So I wish that I was taught more. I wish it was taught more like in depth and in other classes too, because it relates. Oh, sorry, I'm touching on your next question, but yeah, and it relates to like other classes, not just science, because it's such a big issue. Like it can easily be related to like math or science or art or really any subject.
And Ismeen or Yvonne, feel free to touch on what Andrea just asked, which was if you've ever learned about not just like climate science or climate change 101, or if you've learned at all about like some of those solutions or action that not just youth, but the community can even take. And then I'll have a follow-up to that.
I feel like I've heard like maybe small things just throughout like my science classes, like, I don't know, reducing waste or carpooling with other people to reduce carbon dioxide in the air. But other than that, I don't think there's been much else. And I think because there wasn't that much or that many options like given to us on how to reduce our carbon footprints in the atmosphere, it doesn't really seem as exciting for us to do, if that makes sense. So
Yeah, at my school, we go to the same school, but we do learn a bit about carbon footprint. And I also do think that while teachers are, teaching about carbon footprint and how to reduce it, it creates maybe a lack of interest of climate change and climate justice for few students, maybe because they associate it a lot with school. Some people don't like school, unfortunately, but yeah, I do think maybe if there is more, obviously what's happening, the climate crisis isn't a positive thing. If maybe it's taught in a manner that's like not, I wouldn't say like, that's not so forced on students, I guess, maybe like that, it would be more students would have an interest towards it and people won't treat it as something of the past, but more of the present.
And I'll provide kind of a little bit of background of how climate generation has historically viewed this. We're about 17 years old. I would say for the first 10 years of the way that we worked with educators was really focusing on climate science and understanding how carbon emissions work, why the globe is warming, all of that. But I would say over the last 7 years, we've really switched to focusing on how educators can teach about solutions, because we do think that a lot of schools or school districts are teaching the climate science, which is important somewhat to understand, but that solutions piece and how some of those solutions can work. Yvonne, I think you mentioned like recycling and like that personal action, which is incredibly important, but it won't get us there. It's only about 30% of the issue, if even that. It's a much bigger issue on a political and corporation scale. And so that's always what we try to support, is where learning just the carbon footprint is not as important in our view, but possibly some of those impacts, which can again be challenging. It's difficult. Scientists find it difficult to link this first ever tornado in December directly back to climate change. Things like drought and like extreme flooding sometimes are a little easier, but it takes time to actually prove that. But that's what students need to kind of see, because that extreme weather often is not extreme. This is now the normal for the last 20 or 30 years. And so it's pretty difficult, if that's what you're seeing every day, to view it as anything but the usual. And I think, I'm going to look into that, Lucy. That's interesting. Yeah. And that is actually a big thing that Climate Generation also views, is that fossil fuel industry has done a pretty amazing job of putting it back on the consumer. And that's a huge challenge to get over that misinformation as well. So I'm going to stop talking and turn it back over to our panel for our next question, which is, can you describe a time that you have felt powerful in this work?
I wouldn't say maybe powerful, but I guess I would maybe like associate with having a better understanding, like learning more about climate change and what we're going through, I guess would make me feel more powerful, because I did have a better understanding of it. And it just created a whole new insight for me.
I feel like I also, I guess when I first started joining the YA meetings, I met this person that I didn't necessarily feel powerful for myself, but hearing what she was saying, I could feel her feeling empowered, if that makes sense. She was just telling me a story on how climate change is affecting her like grandkids, and I was kind of moved by that. And I also think that, sorry, one second. Sorry, I also think that when I'm able to mention about climate change to other people around me, even like my relatives or like in small talk, especially with like what's happening in Minnesota right now, I feel a little bit more empowered and being able to, you know, spread my knowledge.
The first time I thought of was recently I helped lead, we called it a sit-in, but I don't know if that's the right word for it, where we just had a bunch of youth come to the Capitol in St. Paul and just hold signs, and we had some speakers, and I led like a call and response sort of thing, and that just made me feel very powerful to like be holding a megaphone and like hear other people's voices.
Just on that, I recently sort of figured out that demonstrations are like a little tiny glimpse of what the future might look like. You know, in a certain way, how people would treat each other in the future. Obviously, we're not all going to be running around yelling. Hopefully, we can stop that. Dance instead.
Yeah, that collective action is an incredibly powerful thing to realize early on in your life. I'll go ahead and move on to the next question. If you have any further feedback on previous questions, feel free to go back. I'll just do two more, but this is something I'm always interested in, and just of how youth are doing in this environment. So how has the pandemic and distance learning impacted or affected your work as YA members or your education at school?
I think this is one way that teachers and students can relate to each other really easily, because I see that my teachers are really exhausted because it's hard to keep teaching while there is so much going on in the world, and while like COVID is happening, and there are so many like social opportunities taken away, which for a lot of people is kind of the only place where we can recharge. And students are feeling the same way because it's so hard to learn just with COVID going on. So.
Yeah, I agree. And also as someone like I live with 5 other people in a 3-bedroom house. So that does like leave a strain on mentally and emotionally on you, and then having to basically learn through a screen, and then your teachers as well, you can tell that they're extremely exhausted. That and that led to a lot of like confusion with assignments and assessments, which did greatly, I would say, both positively and negatively affected my work. And I would say that my education, I do think that it varied between classes. So I was taking a few AP classes, for example, and in those AP classes, they had to take some stuff out just because, like, even though it's the same like year, they still had to take things out so that we could get to the test on time, if that makes sense. And when I was taking the test, I was like, I really don't remember if we learned this or not. So it not only just affected that me taking that class, also affected me possibly even getting credit for when I do need to apply that for college.
I think fortunately enough for me, I kind of prefer doing my schoolwork on my own, which is kind of the reason I decided to do PSEO my junior year, even before the pandemic. So I didn't have that much trouble adjusting, I'd say, like my junior year, but definitely I'm missing my sophomore year, but my junior year, I started getting tired of being at home every day and waking up and doing schoolwork, though it wasn't as hard. Like Yasmin said, some of my teachers took some things out because I was taking like college and school type classes at Rosemount, and then some of my like honors or AP classes. And they've had to take out some of the curriculum or the extra work just to make it to like the tests, because they're adjusting to doing schoolwork all online. So yeah, I don't think I really liked that year as much, but it's all just getting used to, I guess.
Thanks for that. And the final question for our panel is, we know this is incredibly challenging and stressful work, because thinking about climate change impacts and solutions, even some of the time or a lot of the time, is really, stressful. And so I'm always curious of what inspires you to keep doing this work, to keep passionate about it, and maybe have others join you in this work.
I think it's knowing that there's so many other people across the world who also like are fighting for this, not just like being like, okay, climate justice, but more they're taking action. And so seeing that, it's just like you feel like you're not like alone. You're not just being like, there's not giving up, because after seeing like, oh my gosh, all this air pollution, all of this stuff, there's no use to it. But then when you see so many other people who are fighting for this and actually seeing positive effects because of that, that pushes me and inspires me to continue.
Yeah, I would kind of say the same thing. Seeing other people fighting for the same thing that I'm fighting for kind of pushes me to fight even harder, because I agree that just the whole topic of climate change in general could be so overwhelming. It could be like, oh, the world is ending tomorrow. But I think just taking little steps and seeing that you're impacting other people's lives, even by educating other people like we're doing here today, I think that can really help. And that's kind of what pushes me to keep on educating others.
I agree with both of you. And the other thing for me is just thinking about my personal future and like goals I want to have. Like I think about how I might want to like buy a house someday or have kids someday. Just all of those normal things that like every person should have the choice to do. And I just think about how I might not get to do that unless we all keep fighting. So that inspires me.
Thanks, all three of you. You may have seen in the chat that we have 2 additional questions, and we definitely have time. If you have any thoughts, you can either respond in the chat or just here. But there's 2 questions. Best book, article, resource about youth climate activism that you've interacted with, or climate justice activism. And then a question that I always struggle with. So someone who lives in Pennsylvania that has a long history of use extraction of fossil fuels. Having climate conversations in some communities is incredibly difficult. How have you worked to overcome the misinformation that climate change isn't caused by humans or is not even real or happening?
Well, we're in a pretty urban area, and what I find for my students and for myself is within the Allegheny County region, generally climate change is taken as a reality. When you leave our county in the Pittsburgh area, then the ideals change a bit, and then you get a lot of pushback about the idea of climate change. But for us, since we're urban, our students, when they want to take action, are received quite well by the communities and welcomed and embraced and supported. So it's been very positive for us, but we stay within our county, I guess you'd like to say. We're very urban, and it's different if you go outside of those borders of our county. So, but we aren't there. So that's how it works for us.
Yeah, and I'm curious if Sophia, Yasmeen, or Yvonne, if you've ever dealt with this. And I ask this because I know, so I also live in Apple Valley, and I live about 5 miles from an oil refinery, a huge oil refinery here in the metro area. And so while Minnesota historically often is considered a liberal state, that's changing a little bit. And we have nuclear plants, we have a lot of emissions. And so even if we can say it's happening, the solutions piece isn't always there. So I'm curious if you all have had to deal with that from classmates, from teachers, and what you've done.
Yeah, I live in like a place where I haven't encountered really people that just don't think it exists. But I would agree that there's a lot of people that think it exists but don't really know how to take action, or just don't take action for whatever reason. And sort of circling back to the question, I think it helps to show how climate activism isn't like a scary thing, it's something that benefits everyone. So when you're having people that, like in Pennsylvania, that work in the fossil fuel industry, instead of saying, oh, you should be a climate activist because your job will get stolen, like show that like there are jobs to be had that work in renewable energy. Like you could get a job building solar panels, or you can get a job building windmills. Like it won't steal your job away, it'll just open up new jobs that are going to benefit you and everyone on the planet.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you, Sophia. And Seth also. I heard that though, Minnesota is a liberal state, I think it's more liberal within the Twin Cities and maybe the surrounding suburban areas, but pretty much everywhere else is conservative. So I think, I haven't necessarily interacted with anyone that was like, I, hate climate change or it's not real. But I think most people are kind of like, I don't know what to do. Like, I acknowledge that it's there, but I don't know what to do, or I don't have the resources, or I don't want to necessarily. I also think that, I know it's like some people are just like, they don't agree with climate change, and you can provide them with all the facts and they simply, are too small-minded to see them. So yeah, I think mostly in my area, at least, most people are just so unaware of the extreme increase in our climate as of recently.
Yeah, and I'll add just a little bit. Lucy, I see you have some more to add too. I see that, I know we only have about 7 minutes left, but I always try to talk about those possibilities that Sophia mentioned, about some of the green resource jobs, but it's hard because they might not be in that community, but alienating anyone doesn't work. But I always sometimes bring it back to like the personal impact or my personal climate story of why I take it seriously. I lived in coastal Alaska. I was seeing these impacts even within the 5 or 10, 20-year history of my community. And then also talking about maybe not like the economic change that has to happen, but the mitigation that communities can take, and that they're already doing, but they don't always talk about that it's because of climate change. And so like coastal communities are having to build wave surge barriers, or communities in the Midwest are having to deal with floods. And so just talking about what we can still do to deal with what these extreme weather events. And I think there is enough of a push to look at those green energy or renewable energy, whatever language works within your community, to at least start that conversation with students. Yeah, go ahead, Lucy. And I think you're still on mute.
Oh, I'm sure that you know, you probably heard of the Global Weirding. There's a little YouTube channel, and that lady is great in terms of talking with people. It's not that people are so much that they don't believe it, but they don't believe it because they don't like the solutions that are being offered. And one of the solutions one of the ways that can unify people is just the idea that we have to protect y'all, the young people. That is the most unifying factor that has been found in, this research. So, I think, what about the idea of just allowing our youth to wrestle through the solutions, not the science, forget that. That's settled. But to wrestle through the kinds of solutions that we want to come up with. Yes, Catherine Hayhoe, exactly.
Yeah, we love working with Catherine on all of her research. Because we only have 4 minutes left, I'm going to put a couple resources. Well, I'll put one resource in the chat, which is this slide deck. I do always send out. I'll send out this recording. I'll send out the slide deck, a couple other pieces of information next week. But I want to share about 2 or 3 more resources, and then we'll be out of time. But if anybody does have questions for our wonderful youth panelists, feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll see if we have a moment right at the end. So some resources, of course, is learning more about youth environmental activists. So learning more about what it is that our youth panel, our youth mentors or activists do, as well as some resources, one of which is our Take Action Toolkit that Climate Generation has produced with collaboration with and then there's some other great resources of how to be adult allies, adult activists as well, from UNICEF, Adult Ally Toolkit, and within that slide deck in the notes section are all the links to those resources. And then if you haven't already, feel free to go ahead and join our Teach Climate Network, which is Climate Generation's climate change education network of about 8,500 educators from around North America that have access to a monthly newsletter on resources and tips, these monthly workshops, Twitter chats, and then of course, kind of all coming together for our annual Summer Institute for Climate Change Education that happens every July. And then join us. In January, we'll really be focusing on dismantling racism and systemic inequity with some amazing partners, Deb Morrison and Kalisa Wing. And so having a great conversation, doing kind of like a Twitter takeover, Twitter bomb on Thursday, January 13th. And then our next workshop will be with our amazing partner, Zakiah Grant with EcoRise, really focusing again on some resources that educators can use to really talk about systemic racism within the classroom and with students. And of course, we always want you to continue to engage with Climate Generation, and of course, and with the 1 minute that we have left, I will of course stay on, but I want to respect everybody's time. I want to thank Yasmin, Yvonne, and Sophia so much for taking the time to chat with us tonight. And if anybody has any quick questions, feel free to unmute or put it in the chat. But otherwise, thank you everybody for joining this Teach Climate Network workshop. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of the evening and a wonderful holiday season.